All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's Poetry from the Field, Notes from the Field. My name is Marcelo Hernandez Castillo, and I am the YubaSutter Poet Laureate here for the YubaSutter Arts and Culture. And it is my pleasure today to welcome Dr. William D. Lopez, who is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and a faculty associate in the Latino Studies program at the University of Michigan. Above many other things, Dr. Lopez is the author, above many other accolades, uh, Dr. Lopez is the author of the book Separated, um, Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. It is right here, and I usually take out the jacket covers because I like to preserve them and I don't like them to get um, messy. So I'll show this right here.
There you go. I have the jacket. I have it with the jacket cover too.
Yay!
So there you
Okay,
go.
okay. Love the art. Love the art. Um, and I just wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement to say that we recognize that the U.S. Sutter Regional Arts Council here in Marysville sits on the ancestral territory and unceded land of the Nisenan, Southern Maidu, Northern Maidu, and Concow, or Northeastern Maidu people, the successors of this land. Today, it is also the home of the Enterprise Rancheria Maidu, originally from Oroville. We recognize that every member of the Yuba Sutter community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land. Consistent with our values and of community inclusion and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the Regional Arts Council's relationship with the Indigenous community. So please visit our website to see more of what you can do. Um, and just wanted to talk also a little bit about some of the things going on. The Real Book Society Book and Film Club is going to be meeting February 13th. So check that out. There is the All About the Arts talk show every third Sunday at 4 p.m. It's live on the Arts and Culture's YouTube channel. And then the Theater Art Gallery free reception for our new anchor artists, Nita Kaiser. So check that out on February 11th. So in 2 days, 5 to 7 p.m. at the Sutter Theater. So the anchor artists, Chris Thompson, Lila Rivera, Jesse Harris, and Dude Green as the welcome, Nina Kaiser. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. William D. Lopez, and he's going to be reading a excerpt from Separated, and then afterwards we'll talk a little bit about it.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for supporting uh, my work and my writing. Of course, it's an honor to be here with you today, and thank you again for joining my class recently. So I'll read a bit of a portion of the introduction of my book. I was ready to go. I was ready to get on a plane, fly to Mexico City, take a bus to a small pueblo on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and interview Santiago, face to face, cara a cara. It would be the perfect culmination for the final chapter of a book I would write about Santiago's arrest, detention, deportation, and return to the very poverty and danger he had attempted to flee with his family in the first place. I envisioned myself sitting across from him, sharing a cup of coffee as we both lamented the violence of the deportation machine that rips men from their day-to-day lives and thrusts them back across the border. It would certainly be a fitting end to the story of a man who had worked in a small automobile shop 9 miles away from the university at which I was writing my dissertation. The peaceful image of a friendly host welcoming me into his home would contrast strongly with the villain whom Immigration and Customs Enforcement was so determined to arrest and deport that it leveraged a county SWAT team with their bulletproof vests and automatic weapons to kick in his door and gather evidence of the illegal drugs he was accused of selling. But I never went to Mexico. I never shook Santiago's hand, and I never hugged him. I never shared so much as a mucho gusto cara a cara with the man whose life had largely become the focal point of mine for 5 years and counting. Simply, the invitation never materialized. The family in Mexico didn't think it was safe for me to come to an area where violence had coaxed them into leaving in the first place. However, not meeting Santiago forced me to expand my naive and limited understanding of the impacts of immigration enforcement. See, it's easy to focus on the acute trauma of deportation, on the violence of the arrest, on the detainment and the removal, to see each individual deportation as a story in itself and each individual deportee as the lone character in a one-act tragedy. It's easy to be drawn into the story of the man removed and to miss the women, families, and community left behind. The U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or ICE, began to gather evidence against Santiago about a week before the raid. They arrested Santiago about 9 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday in November of 2013. But in the hours that followed his arrest, ICE and local law enforcement officers continued arresting Latino men who drove out of Santiago's property throughout the day. One woman, Hilda, watched through her car window as ICE cuffed and shackled her husband and searched his brown body for tattoos, while he stood surrounded by law enforcement patrullas on the side of the road. Hilda then called a local community-based organization, which used its text messaging service to spread the word that any Latino driver going down Huron Avenue was marked for arrest. Then at about 6:30 p.m., ICE and a SWAT unit raided Santiago's first-floor automobile workshop, or taller, and the apartment above it, in which he lived with his sister, wife, 18-year-old son, and 5 children under the age of 6. Kicking in the door, pointing weapons at women and children, and detaining and deporting all the Latino men they found. They left mothers depressed and suicidal, families broken and homeless, a community terrified of the police who swore to protect and serve it, and a community of color worried that its brown skin marked them for legal violence dispensed at the whim of racist law enforcement. So no, Santiago's arrest was not the beginning. His deportation was not the end, and the story was not nearly so simple. I never took that red-eye flight to Mexico. I didn't ride a bus from Mexico City to a small town off the map, hike the hills to a tiny house with a dirt floor, or have coffee poured for me as I sat across from Santiago. Instead, I went to Dunkin' Donuts in a small, everyday Midwest town in southeast Michigan, picked up 2 coffees and 15 donut holes, and went to visit Santiago's sister, Guadalupe, a Mexican woman with dark black hair and glasses who was 26 years old at the time of the raid. Guadalupe and I ate in her tiny kitchen as her youngest daughter, Fatima, ran around us, occasionally stopping for her mother to wipe her mocoy nose from a cold she just couldn't shake. Guadalupe shares with me that Fatima's cold was just one of many. Her 3 children's health had all deteriorated after the raid. She wasn't sure whether their illnesses were the result of the gas that had been echado into the living room as it was being raided, the frio and November air that enveloped Fatima's 2-month-old skin after the agents kicked in the door, or the pavor of military-grade assault weapons pointed at their heads. Guadalupe confesses that her children's erratic health and changing behaviors further complicated the near impossibility of finding jobs and childcare in the absence of Santiago, who was her economic provider. When Guadalupe and I finish talking, she plugs her cell phone into the speaker system she has mounted in the ceiling. She dials in a calling card number she has memorized. Then she calls the small town in Mexico that I will never visit, and Santiago talks openly to me about the raid and his deportation. When he is done, Santiago passes the phone to his wife, Fernanda. Fernanda was 22 years old when Santiago was arrested. She lived with Guadalupe in the apartment above the taller, with her 2 kids, 3-month-old Ignacio and 1.5-year-old Lina. Fernanda, depressed, suicidal, broke, and with kids whose health similarly fell apart, took a bus from Michigan to Texas and walked across the border to Mexico to be with her deported husband. Fernanda and I speak, and the phone is passed yet again to Santiaguito, Santiago's son from a previous marriage who was 18 years old at the time of his father's arrest and was also in the raided apartment. Like Fernanda and Guadalupe, Santiago had questioned if that Thursday in November was the day he was going to die. Then, like his father, he was cuffed, detained, and deported while his girlfriend Jessica watched. After more than an hour, Guadalupe tells me that she needs to leave to pick up her older daughter Sofia and start to bundle up Fatima in her winter jacket to take her along. All three of them leave, so there is no one physically in the apartment except me. But Santiago, Santiaguitos, and Fernanda's voices continue to fill the room. It's haunting, hearing their voices and hearing their children in the background. Haunting but appropriate, the citizen comfortable and warm, the family scattered, scared, cold. Not going to Mexico forced me to think deeply about a vastly different side of immigration violence. I was made to reckon with an aspect of immigration enforcement too often overlooked. Those left behind, who are not the targets of immigration enforcement actions, who may not even themselves be undocumented, must nonetheless deal with a militarized, traumatic, and profoundly violent deportation machine, the repercussions of which are often painfully familial. These stories, the stories of Guadalupe, Fernanda, Hilda, and others like them, the stories so frequently made invisible, form the crux of the book that you are about to read.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, the introduction to your book. And since this is a recording and we don't usually have, everybody who's here, I'll clap for everybody who will be in
Appreciate that.
an audience. Thank you so much. And,
Yeah.
I'm really grateful for this book, and I'm really grateful for this, approach that you do. I couldn't help but notice Ruth Behar does the forward, and you have an epigraph by Ruth Behar that says, "Anthropology that doesn't break your heart just isn't worth doing anymore." And kind of her approach the vulnerable from in the vulnerable observer. I'm not, I'm not an anthropologist by any means, so I don't know where that her book fits into the larger scope of anthropology, um, and how that might have changed the conversation. But I imagine, it's very central to your approach to this book, and maybe with Dr. Behar in mind. How was it like writing this book for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you noticed Dr. Behar's forward at the beginning. Um, so, as you mentioned, she's the author of the book Vulnerable Observer, and so where she fits in the field of anthropology, she really pushed the writing of anthropologists. She was an early feminist anthropologist and really pushed the writers to be more present, right, and to be more overt with their identities, right, including vulnerable identities, but also our identities of privilege, right? Um, and so lots of what I wrestled with in this book is something you and I have talked about too, but how to reckon with being part of marginalized and privileged groups at the same time. Um, because what we really want to do is tell complicated, rich stories about who we are as human beings, but also about who our communities are, and we are members of those communities. Um, at the same time, we exist within a certain power structure, right? And these power structures often subject our communities to violence in the case of deportation. So I wrestled a lot with how to present, being as I described in the book, overly educated or highly educated Latino myself, lighter skins than many of my peers, including my family, or including my brother, I mean. Um, and I have a white partner. As I mentioned, I guess I haven't mentioned it. I have a white partner. I work at the university, right? So there is a number of privileges that I have that made my life really fundamentally different than lots of the people in the book. Um, at the same time, the reason many folks trusted me is because this was my community, right? These are people I know and love, or at least know and love people who are close to them in some way, even if I ended up meeting the people I directly spoke with a little bit later.
Yeah, and you mentioned you are part of this community, and there's so much trust that is required on the part of the subject of who of these stories that you're bringing to light, um, and I imagine how much work goes into establishing that meeting and allowing allowing yourself to be empathetic and understanding of the positions that we're coming in from, and I'm just also taken aback by how it is that the different ways that we can address different issues within our communities. Maybe even if we don't identify, um, a lot of the activist work that gets done. Some people say, "Well, what can I do? What can I help if I'm not within that community?" And it's really identifying those identifying that the privileges that you occupy is one way that you can stand up for. Is something that the people who you want to help don't have
Mhm.
that visibility. There's this also this other book. Oh, I'm blinking on the name. Halfway Home. Um,
Okay.
I don't know if oh, I'll get it right now, but it also talks about this. You mentioned in your book an economy of favors, leverage their discretion. Um, I don't know, maybe what kinds of interactions, I'm curious about this kind of interview process and not just data collection but story collection, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to hone in on the details that create for the most I don't want to say like spectacular narrative, but that are truest to the lived and emotional experiences that they had. And so, how was that process of sitting down and being a not a passive observer, but an active listener in their stories? Was it recorded, tape recorded? Because I imagine, being tape recorded also, you always put on a filter.
Mhm.
Um, or was it more just listening and then and then kind of synthesizing the information?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and part of it is that so I'm a professor, and and lots of what we wrestle with in the academy is this difference between quantitative data, so stuff we count, stuff we measure, stuff we weigh, right, and qualitative data, so things like pictures or stories, and interviews are in this category as well. But for many of our communities of color, right, the data that we have are our stories, right? So like surveys don't capture our experiences. Surveys don't even categorize us right. They call it a race, they call it a religion, they call it ethnicity. We don't know what boxes we're filling in, right? So part of this is that the experience of many of our communities really hasn't been captured in a way in which it's been talked about on a larger scale, right? And so, one of the questions, of course, is what's the benefit of talking about our communities on a larger scale? Which is exactly, what I went into this work thinking. The benefit is that we need to show people need to understand the way particular communities who haven't been described and captured in these other ways are experiencing the brunt of this unjust law enforcement, right? And this is done through stories and through observations and through narratives. So in response to your question, I did. I won't get too nerdy, but I interviewed three subgroups of people, and briefly, those were folks who provided services to those who were impacted by the raid or events like it, their families and friends, or families and close friends, or close relatives, usually spouses or significant others, and then the people involved in the raid. Um, and so, yeah, they were in your, or rather, the tape recorder was on. Um, and one of the things that you find is folks who engage in advocacy work or kind of community representatives are very used to being recorded. And part of the service they do, which I think, Marcelo, this is not unlike what you did in my class, right? Part of the service that we do is speak about these topics. It's not hard to get these folks like us to talk about these topics. It's part of their currency, right?
Mhm.
Whereas for folks who are less involved in these formal circles, yeah, it's um, part of it is the recording is only a very small portion of all of the interactions you have, And sometimes the collection of those interactions may come in like official field work, like I'm going to observe every rally that someone organizes, or may just come with like, these are my people and these are who I spend my time with anyway, right? So yeah, it's part of doing work where you're gathering stories is knowing what kind of relationships are critical to telling the truer, deeper story that you want to share. And this is a long-winded answer. The last thing I'll share is that you also really have to be open to sometimes being the muse. So you've gathered this information and you don't really know the story you're going to share, and you have to have faith that it's going to show up. And then once you start writing, you have to be ready for another story to emerge, right? And that's what I'm finding in some of my work now. The work that the story that I'm telling isn't what I thought was going to be the primary story when I started it, but intellectually and emotionally, you get pulled and pushed and pulled in different directions, and you grow. And it's kind of an honor to be the one telling a story that you didn't even know existed when you started gathering data, talking to people, right?
Yeah, and so much gets left out of the page that is really just lives between you and that person,
Yeah.
that is just as valuable and is just as cherished, even though it's not, recorded for posterity. But that
Uh-huh.
doesn't diminish the value of those interactions.
No, and
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I want to add just one thing because I've been thinking about this a lot as I start writing again, this time with many, many more recorded interviews.
Mhm.
Early writing, I thought the biggest service you could do to someone was tell as much of their story as you could on the printed page, right? And I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think the biggest service, the biggest, the best thing you can do for folks is allow them to shape your lives and allow them to make you a better person, right? A better family member, for some of us, better fathers, better partners, better spouses, and better community members. And sometimes the people who've made us better people aren't the ones who take up the most of our text, right? And that's okay too. Like, they may not have told the story in a way that the public will change because of it, but they certainly shaped who they are. That's actually helped me in the writing when I have to, as you said, deal with not just sharing every single story I've come across, right? Because you do leave, I mean, you probably leave 80% of them out.
Yeah, it's yeah, in approaching new work, and this is a series that we focus a lot on poetry, but I like to remind a lot of people that some of the same conversations that we have around poetry, some of the same conversations that we've had around creative nonfiction, are the same conversations that we're having here. Is how to attend to other people and how to be a responsive, active listener to the surroundings, how to just be aware and present in the spaces that you occupy. And that work can be work of anthropology, it can be work of public health, and it can be, as this class that you teach, the health impacts of law enforcement violence in the U.S. um, and I'm just really grateful that you merge those two, the qualitative and the quantitative, and that's kind of uh, where your work has focused on. Um, it's I was part of this project called the Art for Justice project, and they were backed by a lot of data centered organizations that were missing the humanizing aspect of the stories. That you can only argue so much for somebody in court with the statistics, with the data, and what really carries through is the stories that we encounter, is the stories that we retell. And so I'm grateful for you in preserving these stories and all of the work that you do in bringing awareness to these kinds of violences that are happening, um, on a national level, but also at a very local level, there in this small town. And I believe you do name the town in which the raid takes place, but if you did not, I won't say it. Um,
I didn't specifically, so
I,
Washtenaw County is our county and the
Washtenaw
city is.
County, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I figured that, but it's at the very local level. And for me,
Right.
living there, in Ann Arbor too, it took me going there to realize, oh, this is also happening, in my own hometown. And it wasn't until I came back to this town in Northern California and became more involved with the arts that I realized there is these many case scenarios happening on an individual local level that get enacted out on like a more national conversation, a worldwide conversation. And so that's kind of I like this is just like, you know, praise for your book and your work of being able to establish those larger intellectual conversations from the very localized aspect, and getting us to see that this isn't happening in somewhere far away. It's happening right next door, right in this community here. They just recently um, uh, eliminated the jail's collaboration with ICE because it was serving as an ICE detention center and a jail, and so they cut that contract recently for so many reasons. Not that they were like willing to do it; it was something that they were more like forced because of conditions in for detainees. But it's happening, you know, here in every community that we have, and sometimes people just either aren't aware of it or maybe don't want to be aware of it because they don't want to think that that kind of violence is happening, you know, here. But the militarization of of police is something that is happening just on every local level. So I'm glad that you're bringing attention to that. Maybe in departing, if you could perhaps talk to our listeners, maybe some budding writers, thinkers, intellectuals, scholars, maybe some advice that you would give on some of the projects they might take on, some of the things that they might observe, you know, maybe being an active observer, a vulnerable observer. What advice would you
Yeah.
give to?
Oh, I love as I tell others, I love writing and I love thinking and writing about writing. Right? I'm real interested in the process of how we do it. And one of the best pieces of advice I heard, and something that I really take with me, is that if you only write when you're confident and optimistic, you'll never write. So you are capable of doing very good writing, even when you feel pretty bleak, and even when you're not confident in your writing ability, right? So, and this just kind of comes with practice, that whether you feel optimistic and confident or whether you feel pretty pessimistic about the state of the world and you don't really feel like you're making your way outside of somewhere, you're stuck in that writing, you're still perfectly capable of successful writing at that time.
I love that, and I'm going to put that on my syllabuses from now on. If you only write when you're confident, you're never going to write.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I like it too. It's great because I mean, I think what percent of the time we're writing are we confident? I mean, if 20% of the time we're writing, we think we're pretty good writers, that's probably very successful.
That's shooting high. I'd be like,
Right.
it's like 5%
Right.
maybe, you know, in all of the time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again for being here. And again, Dr. William Lopez is the author of Separated: Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid, out from Johns Hopkins University Press. Thank you again so much for being here and for talking with us and reading your work. I look forward to your further books and scholarship, and just your presence on Twitter. Follow Dr. Lopez on Twitter.
Great. Thanks. It was great to be here. Good luck with everything. Take care.
All right.